Welcome to Calm History, where we travel back through time in stories designed not only to inform, but also to help you relax and drift peacefully into rest. Tonight, we journey into one of the most legendary conflicts of the ancient world, the Trojan War. A story woven of myth and memory, of heroes, gods, and a city whose name still echoes across the ages. As you listen, allow the calm rhythm of history to carry you. If you enjoy these journeys, please remember to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps us bring more timeless stories to you. The sun rises slowly over the Aegean Sea. Its golden light spills across calm waters, rippling in soft patterns as the waves kiss the shore. The air is gentle, carrying with it the smell of salt and earth, mingling with the faint fragrance of thyme and wild herbs that grow along the rocky coastline. Somewhere inland, the first birds stir among the olive trees, their song a reminder of life's quiet persistence. Yet beneath this tranquility lies a story that has haunted human memory for more than 3,000 years, the story of Troy. The name itself feels like an echo across time. Troy. A single word that carries both glory and destruction, love and betrayal, courage and tragedy. When we whisper it, we are not just recalling a city or a war, but the entire world of myth and memory that has attached itself to its stones. Troy is a place where the line between history and legend blurs so thoroughly that one cannot be untangled from the other. For most people, the Trojan War lives through Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These epics, once sung by traveling poets, became the foundation of Western storytelling. Within them, we meet gods who interfere in mortal affairs, heroes who fight not only for survival but for honor, and a city that endures for 10 long years beneath siege. We remember Achilles, the unmatched warrior with his fatal heel. Hector, noble defender of his home. Paris, whose love or lust sparked the flames of conflict. And Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, whose face, it is said, launched 1,000 ships. But what lies beneath these stories? Did such a war ever happen? Was there truly a city by the Dardanelles whose walls fell in flame? Or is the Trojan War only a grand tale, woven by poets to explain the fragility of peace and the futility of human pride? These are questions that have fascinated historians and archaeologists for centuries. And though many answers remain cloaked in mystery, fragments of truth have surfaced, like shards of pottery unearthed in the dust, hinting at a reality behind the myth. Imagine, for a moment, standing among the ruins of Hizarlik, the site in modern-day Turkey identified as the ancient Troy. The land is quiet now, touched only by the wind. Stones rise unevenly from the earth, remnants of walls that once stood strong against invaders. As you trace your fingers across the weathered rock, you might hear the whisper of time, the imagined clash of bronze against bronze, the cries of warriors, the crackling of torches as fire consumed the city. The ruins are not merely silent witnesses, they are echoes, waiting for us to listen. To begin this story, we must step into the world of the Late Bronze Age, a time roughly between 1500 and 1200 BC. It was a world of kings and palaces, of trade routes that carried tin and copper, the lifeblood of bronze, across seas and mountains. It was a world where the Mycenaean Greeks, with their fortified citadels at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, looked across the water toward Anatolia, where Troy stood at a crucial crossroads of commerce. Between east and west, Troy guarded the entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow strait leading to the Black Sea. Whoever controlled this passage held power over trade itself. And so we begin to see the outlines of why Troy mattered, not only as a stage for myth, but as a city of real strategic importance. Its wealth came from its position, from the caravans and ships that passed near its harbors, bringing goods from faraway lands. This was not merely a city of romance and tragedy, but one that pulsed with economic and political significance. Yet myth transforms reality. For the ancient Greeks, Troy became more than a city. It became a canvas upon which they painted their deepest fears and desires. It was a place where gods themselves could stride into battle, where human pride invited divine wrath, and where the fragile threads of destiny could be seen clearly against the loom of eternity. Tonight, as we wander slowly through this tale, we will allow both myth and reality to live side by side. We will not rush to separate them. Instead, we will walk gently through their interwoven paths. Just as the ancients once told these stories around the hearthfire, blending history with imagination, we too will follow that rhythm, drifting calmly between fact and fable. The Trojan War, whether real or imagined, has endured because it speaks to something universal. It is a story of longing and rivalry, of loyalty and betrayal, of bravery and the tragic cost of ambition. It is about walls that can be toppled, no matter how strong, and about human hearts that can be swayed, no matter how firm. As the morning light fully embraces the imagined city before us, we will step back in time. From the quiet shores of today, we will journey into the bustling world of Bronze Age palaces and courts. We will meet kings whose names echo in clay tablets and in song. We will explore the myths that grew from whispers of real events, myths that have shaped literature and imagination for millennia. This is not just the tale of a war. It is the story of how memory endures, how myth preserves fragments of truth, and how even ruins can still speak to us if we are willing to listen. And so, with the first light of dawn spreading across the ancient world, we begin the journey into the true story of the Trojan War, a story of myths and reality, side by side. The Bronze Age was a world of brilliance and fragility. It was a time when kings ruled from palaces of stone and mud brick, adorned with painted frescoes of warriors, dancers, and ships gliding across the sea. Bronze, forged from copper and tin, was the metal that gave this age its name. Its sheen glinted on swords, helmets, and shields, but it also underpinned agriculture, trade, and prestige. Wherever bronze traveled, so too did ideas, stories, and rivalries. To understand Troy and the war that would later echo through legend, we must first pause and look at the vast world that surrounded it. Picture a map of the eastern Mediterranean in the centuries around 1300 BC. To the west lay the Mycenaean Greeks, a rising power whose citadels crowned the hills of the Peloponnese. Each city-state was ruled by a wanax, a king who commanded warriors, scribes, and artisans. At Mycenae, at Tiryns, at Pylos, these rulers built monumental walls, so large that later generations believed giants, the Cyclopes themselves, must have lifted the stones. Within these fortresses, palaces glowed with painted halls, storerooms brimmed with jars of oil and wine, and scribes pressed lines of linear script into clay tablets, recording taxes, rations, and tribute. Across the sea to the east lay Anatolia, a land of mountains, rivers, and fertile plains. Here, empires rose and fell. The Hittite Empire, centered in modern-day Turkey, stretched across vast territories, holding sway over countless smaller states. Their clay tablets, written in cuneiform, reveal a network of treaties, rivalries, and wars. They speak of Wilissa, a city many scholars believe to be Troy. These records, though fragmentary, are invaluable. They show us that Troy was not an isolated myth, but a known and contested power in the political landscape of its time. Further south, Egypt flourished under the new kingdom. Pharaohs such as Ramses II built temples whose carved walls still endure, telling stories of battles, rituals, and offerings to the gods. Egyptian ships plied the waters of the eastern Mediterranean, bringing gold, grain, and luxury goods. Farther east still, the cities of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria, continued their long traditions of kingship and law, of trade and myth. This was a connected world, linked by the currents of commerce and the fragile threads of diplomacy. And at its heart, like a gateway between east and west, stood Troy. Nestled near the narrow straits that separate the Aegean from the Black Sea, Troy's position was strategic beyond measure. Every ship that sought to pass into the Black Sea's rich fisheries and trade routes had to pass by its shores. Caravans laden with goods from inland Anatolia would have found their way toward its markets. To hold Troy was to command the passage, and with it, wealth. Let us imagine this world in more detail. Step into a bustling port in the late Bronze Age. Ships of oaken hull and woven sails are moored along a wooden dock. The smell of pitch and salt fills the air as sailors unload amphorae filled with olive oil, jars of wine, bundles of wool, and ingots of copper. Traders haggle in many tongues, Greek, Luwian, Hittite, while oxen pull carts toward the inland roads. In the markets, One might hear music played on lyres, see women weaving brightly dyed fabrics, and smell bread baking in clay ovens. Troy's walls stand in the distance, gleaming in the afternoon sun, a reminder that behind trade and prosperity lay the looming presence of military power. The Mycenaean Greeks, for all their splendor, were not unified. Each city-state had its own ruler, its own rivalries. Yet they shared a culture, one of warrior ideals, heroic poetry, and deep ties to the sea. They looked outward with ambition. Archaeological evidence reveals that Mycenaean pottery traveled widely, found on distant shores in Cyprus, Anatolia, and beyond. Their warriors, clad in boar's tusk helmets and carrying long thrusting spears, sailed as raiders and traders alike. For them, Troy was both a neighbor and a prize, a city whose capture could mean control of wealth and access to the east. Meanwhile, the Hittites regarded Troy, or Wilissa, as part of their sphere of influence. They signed treaties with its rulers, naming them as allies or vassals. Yet these ties were fragile. In one tablet, a Hittite king complains of hostilities involving the Ahiawa, a name many scholars link to the Achaeans, the Greeks of Homer's epics. Here, hidden in clay, we glimpse the outline of a conflict that could easily have inspired legends: Greeks pressing eastward, Hittites defending influence, and Troy caught between them. But history is rarely straightforward. Wars of the Bronze Age were not always fought for the reasons poets later imagined. A raid could be sparked by the theft of goods, the capture of slaves, or disputes over trade. A city might fall not for love of a queen, but for its wealth, its ports, or its position on the map. Yet when such events are told and retold, over centuries of song and story, they transform. A quarrel over shipping rights becomes the wrath of gods. The capture of a woman becomes the cause of a decade-long war. Myth paints reality with brighter, deeper colors. Still, before we let myth take hold, we must sit with the reality of this fragile, glittering age. The Bronze Age world was deeply interconnected, but also perilously unstable. Its empires depended on trade routes that could be disrupted, on fragile alliances that could be broken, and on resources that were always finite. Around 1200 BC, this world would collapse in what historians call the Bronze Age collapse. Cities burned, trade faltered, and writing systems disappeared. The Trojan War, whether real or legendary, sits on the cusp of that decline. For now, however, we are standing in a world still full of power and potential. Troy is strong, its walls rising tall against the sky. The Mycenaean Greeks are ambitious, looking eastward. The Hittites keep watch from their inland capital, balancing treaties and threats. Egypt flourishes to the south, while Mesopotamia endures to the east. Into this world, myth would one day weave the golden thread of the Trojan War. And as the sun sets over the Aegean in our imagined scene, casting the waters in shades of crimson and violet, the stage is set. The players are gathering, though they do not yet know it. Soon, love and pride, politics and power, will collide. Soon, a single story will grow to fill centuries. The wind brushes gently across the plain of the Troad. Grass bends and whispers, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea. Rising above this plain is a mound of earth and stone, layered with centuries of human habitation. To stand here, at Hazarlik in northwestern Turkey, is to stand on the site that many believe to be Troy. Beneath the soil lies not one city, but many, built, destroyed, and rebuilt over more than 3,000 years. Each layer holds a chapter in the long life of this fabled place. Archaeologists first uncovered Troy in the late 19th century, led by Heinrich Schliemann, a man both visionary and reckless. Driven by his devotion to Homer's Iliad, he dug with passion, sometimes destroying as much as he revealed. Yet his work brought Troy back to life for the modern world. Today, careful excavations have refined his discoveries, showing us a complex city with multiple phases, from Troy around 3000 BC to Troy 9 in the Roman era. The most compelling for our story are the layers of Troy 6 and Troy 7, dating roughly between 1700 and 1100 BC. These were the cities that stood during the height of the Late Bronze Age, when Mycenaean Greece and the Hittite Empire flourished. Their remains suggest a city both prosperous and fortified, a city that could inspire both admiration and envy. Imagine approaching Troy in its prime. From a distance, you would see its massive walls rising above the plain. Built of limestone blocks and reinforced with mud brick, these walls were not simple barriers but statements of power. Some stood as high as 5 meters, crowned with towers that looked down upon the land below. The gates were imposing, built to impress friend and foe alike. To stand before them was to feel the weight of a city determined to endure. Inside the walls, life pulsed with energy. Houses of stone and mud brick clustered along winding streets. Courtyards filled with the sound of animals and the chatter of families. Workshops echoed with the clink of bronze being hammered into tools and weapons, the hum of looms weaving wool into fine cloth, the scrape of potters shaping clay into vessels for trade. Smoke curled upward from hearths, carrying the scent of bread and roasted meat. At the city's heart stood the citadel, a place of authority and reverence. Here, rulers held court, priests conducted rituals, and storerooms brimmed with grain, oil, and precious goods. From the citadel, one could look outward to the plains, where farmers tended fields of barley and wheat, and shepherds guided flocks. Beyond lay the waters of the Dardanelles, where ships sailed, their sails catching the wind, carrying Troy's wealth outward to distant lands. Troy was not merely a fortress, it was a hub of culture and trade. Archaeological finds reveal influences from both east and west. Pottery from Mycenaean Greece, seals and tablets in Anatolian styles, objects from as far as Cyprus and the Levant, all speak to Troy's role as a crossroads. It was a place where languages mingled, where merchants bargained in many tongues, and where foreign envoys likely negotiated alliances and treaties. And yet, with prosperity came danger. Troy's very position, so strategically placed at the gateway to the Black Sea, made it vulnerable. Its wealth, drawn from controlling trade routes and harboring ships, made it a tempting target for rivals. To the Mycenaeans, across the Aegean, Troy must have seemed both neighbor and prize, a city whose fall could mean dominance of the seas. To the Hittites, it was a valued ally but also a fragile link in a chain of contested power. When we picture Troy today, we often imagine it through the lens of Homer, a city of shining towers, defended by noble Hector, besieged for 10 long years. The archaeological Troy is humbler, yet no less fascinating. The houses were practical rather than luxurious, their walls thick to protect against both enemy and weather. The streets were narrow, sometimes steep, paved with stone in certain places. In times of war, these streets would have echoed with the footsteps of warriors rushing to the gates, the cries of children, the shouts of commanders. But in times of peace, Troy was not a city of war but of life. Women tended households, weaving cloth or grinding grain. Children played in courtyards, their laughter carrying across the rooftops. Farmers brought produce from the countryside into the markets, where traders weighed out goods with bronze scales. Musicians plucked lyres, filling the air with melodies that drifted over the walls. Priests lit fires at sacred altars, offering prayers to the gods who watched over city and sea. The gods themselves are woven deeply into Troy's identity. In Homer's tale, Troy was beloved by Apollo, the archer god, who defended its walls against the Greeks. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, stood with the Greeks but was said to have temples within the city. The blending of cultures at Troy meant its pantheon was rich and varied, drawing from both Anatolian and Greek traditions. Every hearthfire, every offering of oil or grain, reinforced the belief that divine protection was bound to the city's fate. And so, when we think of Troy, we must hold both images in our minds. The mythic city of Homer, where shining armor clashed and gods walked among men. And the historical Troy, a living community of farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and rulers, whose daily lives carried on beneath walls built for both trade and defense. As evening falls over our imagined Troy, the walls glow red in the light of the setting sun. The sounds of the market fade, replaced by the lowing of cattle and the crackle of hearthfires. Families gather, sharing bread and stories. Above them, the citadel stands watch, its torches flickering against the sky. The city seems eternal, but history tells us that no walls, however strong, endure forever. Soon Troy's fate will be bound with myth. Soon, the seeds of conflict, sown in both politics and poetry, will sprout into a story that the world will never forget. The air grows quieter, as if the present world fades, and we step into the land of story, a place where gods walk beside mortals, where beauty sparks rivalry, and where destiny is woven not only by human hands, but by divine will. For the Trojan War, in the telling of the ancients, did not begin with ships or swords. It began with a quarrel among the gods, with a single fruit, the golden apple of discord. The tale begins at a wedding. On Mount Olympus, the gods and goddesses gather to celebrate the union of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea goddess. It is a joyous occasion, filled with music, ambrosia, and laughter. All the immortals are present, save one. Eris, goddess of strife, has not been invited. Angered at the insult, she arrives nonetheless, carrying with her a gift. She tosses a golden apple among the guests. Upon its shining surface is a simple inscription, "To the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately lay claim to the prize. Hera, queen of the gods, majestic and proud. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, fierce and brilliant. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire, radiant in her charm. None will yield. The hall fills with tension, and soon the gods realize that a mortal judge must decide who is most deserving. That judge is Paris, a prince of Troy. He is said to be tending his flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida when Hermes, the messenger god, brings the 3 goddesses before him. Imagine the scene: the young prince, startled, standing among his sheep, as the radiant forms of divinity descend. One by one, they make their offers. Hera promises him power, dominion over kings and empires. Athena promises him wisdom and glory in battle. And Aphrodite promises him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris listens, torn between the weight of their gifts. Power, wisdom, or love. At last, he places the golden apple in Aphrodite's hand. In that moment, the fate of Troy is sealed. For the woman Aphrodite promised him is none other than Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. This story, simple and strange, would echo through centuries as the spark of the Trojan War. Of course, historians remind us that wars are rarely started by beauty alone. Cities do not burn for a single love affair. The tale of the golden apple is symbolic, a mythic way of explaining conflict, of dramatizing rivalry and human desire. Hera's promise of power, Athena's promise of victory, Aphrodite's promise of love, these represent the forces that drive nations into war, ambition, glory, and desire. And Paris himself becomes a symbol of choice and consequence. By selecting love, he rejected wisdom and power, and in doing so brought disaster upon his city. Ancient audiences would have recognized the moral weight of his decision. To them, the story was not only entertainment but also instruction, a reminder of how fragile fortune can be, how a single choice can unravel the destiny of kings. Yet, like all myths, the story of the golden apple also carried beauty. Picture the apple itself, gleaming in the sunlight of Olympus, rolling across marble floors, a small object with immense power. Picture Paris, a shepherd prince, gazing into the eyes of goddesses, his heart torn. Picture Aphrodite's smile as she receives the apple, her promise already unfolding like a thread that cannot be cut. In later retellings, this moment became one of the most famous judgments in myth, the Judgment of Paris. Artists painted it on vases and frescoes, poets sang of it, dramatists reimagined it. For them, it was the perfect beginning to a story of war, a conflict born not merely of politics but of the desires of gods and men alike. Yet beneath the myth lies the echo of history. Why would storytellers choose a prince of Troy, rather than some nameless figure, to play this role? Perhaps because Troy itself was seen as a city balanced between choices, between east and west, between power and vulnerability. Paris's decision mirrors the city's own fate, a choice that leads to both greatness and destruction. As the myth unfolds, Aphrodite prepares to make good on her promise. Paris, blessed by her favor, will soon travel across the sea to meet Helen, the queen whose beauty will ignite the war to come. But before we sail with him, let us pause to reflect on the power of myth itself. For myths are not falsehoods, they are truths told in a different language. They do not always tell us what happened, but they tell us what mattered. In the golden apple, in the rivalry of goddesses, in the choice of a shepherd prince, the ancients saw reflected the eternal tensions of human life, the pull of love, the hunger for power, the longing for wisdom, and the cost of every decision. As night falls upon the slopes of Mount Ida, we can almost see Paris watching the stars, unaware of the storm that his choice has set in motion. The sheep settle quietly in their pens, the mountains fall into shadow, and the soft hum of crickets fills the air. For now, all is still. Yet destiny has already begun to stir. In the twilight hours, the palace at Sparta glows with firelight. Torches flicker against polished walls. The scent of roasted meats and honeyed wine drifts through the hall. Here sits Menelaus, king of Sparta, broad-shouldered and strong, ruler of a land renowned for its warriors. At his side is Helen, the woman whom poets called the fairest of all mortals, daughter of Zeus and Leda, a queen whose beauty seemed touched by divinity itself. Helen's story was already one of legend before Paris ever stepped ashore in Sparta. In myth, she was born from an egg, the child of Zeus, who had taken the form of a swan. Her beauty was so striking that when she came of age, kings and princes from across Greece sought her hand. To prevent bloodshed, her stepfather Tyndareus made them all swear an oath, no matter who Helen chose, the rest would defend her marriage against any who dared violate it. Helen chose Menelaus, brother of the powerful Agamemnon, and so she became queen of Sparta. And yet, when Paris arrived, handsome, charming, favored by Aphrodite herself, the course of destiny shifted. Some stories say he came under the guise of a diplomatic mission, welcomed as a guest in Menelaus's hall. Greek tradition placed great importance on hospitality, or xenia. To betray a host's trust was a crime not only against man, but against the gods who guarded those sacred bonds. And yet, this is exactly what Paris would do. One evening, when Menelaus was away, some say he had traveled to Crete, Paris made his move. With Aphrodite's enchantments, or perhaps with Helen's willing heart, he persuaded her to sail with him back to Troy. Ancient poets disagreed on whether Helen went gladly or whether she was carried away against her will. In some versions, she is a victim, kidnapped by force. In others, she chooses love, forsaking duty for passion. This ambiguity gave the story its enduring power. Was Helen the cause of the war, or its pawn? Was she a betrayer, or the betrayed? Picture the scene. Under a moonlit sky, Paris and Helen slip away. The waters of the Aegean glimmer in silver light as their ship departs from the Spartan shore. The sailors row in silence, their oars dipping rhythmically into the sea. Behind them, Sparta sleeps, unaware that its queen is gone. Ahead of them lies Troy, where Helen's arrival will alter the fate of kingdoms. For the Greeks, this act was unforgivable. Not only had Paris broken the sacred laws of hospitality, he had insulted Menelaus and, by extension, all of Greece. And bound by their earlier oath, the former suitors of Helen were now obliged to honor their vow. They would stand with Menelaus, they would sail to Troy, and they would fight to bring her back. Thus myth transformed a personal grievance into a collective cause. Yet behind the myth may lie echoes of historical tension. Could the story of Helen's abduction have been a poetic memory of real conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and the wealthy city of Troy? Perhaps the Greeks sought not a queen, but control of trade routes and treasure. In this light, Helen becomes more symbol than person, the embodiment of what was taken, the justification for what was fought. And still, the image of Helen endured. To the poets, she was more than mortal. She was a living flame, a prize worth 1,000 lives, a beauty that blurred the line between human and divine. In Homer's Iliad, Helen gazes from the walls of Troy, mourning the destruction her presence has caused. She speaks tenderly of Hector, even as her heart aches with guilt. In other traditions, she is blamed, reviled as the cause of suffering. And yet, no one can deny her power. It is worth pausing here to imagine Helen not as a myth, but as a woman of the late Bronze Age. If she lived, what might she have been like? She would have worn long linen or woolen gowns, dyed with rich colors. She may have adorned herself with bronze or gold jewelry, her hair braided and perfumed. As queen, she would have overseen the workings of the palace, weaving rooms, storerooms, the rhythms of servants and retainers. Her life would not have been idle beauty alone, it would have been bound by ritual, responsibility, and expectation. And yet, her name would forever be tied not to her duties, but to the war that bore her away. When Paris and Helen reached Troy, the city welcomed them. Whether out of duty to their prince or enchantment at her radiance, the Trojans accepted her into their walls. Some must have feared the consequences, others may have celebrated her arrival. For love, or for folly, Troy had embraced the spark that would ignite its downfall. As dawn rises in our imagined scene, the ships of Sparta and Mycenae are already being prepared. Across Greece, kings remember the oath they swore. Agamemnon sharpens his plans. Odysseus hesitates, reluctant to leave Ithaca. Achilles, still young, awaits his destiny. The war has not yet begun, but the sails are being unfurled, the prows turned eastward. In myth, all of this began with the beauty of one woman. In history, it may have begun with the lure of Troy's wealth and position. But in either telling, the abduction of Helen became the moment when personal desire collided with political obligation, and from that collision rose one of the greatest stories ever told. The summons has gone out across the land of Greece. From valley to valley, from citadel to citadel, word spreads that Helen has been taken and that her husband Menelaus calls for justice. Bound by the oath they once swore, the kings and princes of Greece must now prepare for war. What began as a quarrel between two men has become the cause of many, and soon, the shores of the Aegean will be alive with the sound of mustering armies. Imagine the scene at Mycenae, the citadel of Agamemnon. The morning sun glints against the massive lion gate, where carved beasts guard the entrance. Within the walls, the king stands tall, his bronze armor polished, his cloak heavy with purple dye. Agamemnon is not merely a brother defending Menelaus's honor, he is a man with ambitions of his own. To lead a war against Troy is to prove himself the greatest of kings, to bind the Greek world together under his command. He accepts the call, not only out of duty, but out of hunger for power. From Sparta, Menelaus sharpens his resolve. His pride has been wounded, his household dishonored. Every ship that joins the cause strengthens his claim, not only to his wife but to his rightful place among kings. The insult Paris delivered burns in him like a wound that cannot heal. Yet Agamemnon and Menelaus are not alone. Across the Greek world, other lords prepare. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, at first resists the call. He is a man of cunning rather than brute force, known for his clever mind. Some stories say he tried to feign madness, yoking an ox and a donkey to his plow and sowing salt instead of seed. But when the envoys tested him, placing his infant son Telemachus before the plow, Odysseus swerved to avoid the child, proving his sanity. Reluctantly, he joined the cause. His absence from Ithaca would one day grow into another epic, the long voyage home sung in the Odyssey. Then there is Achilles, the son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. Still young, but already famed for his skill in battle, he is destined to be the greatest warrior of the Greeks. Yet his fate is clouded by prophecy. It is said he must choose between two lives, one long but obscure, the other short but filled with glory. His mother hides him, disguised among maidens at the court of Skyros, hoping to shield him from war. But Odysseus discovers him, tricking Achilles into revealing his warrior's nature. With sword in hand, Achilles joins the cause, knowing that Troy will be both his greatest triumph and his undoing. From Salamis comes Ajax, mighty and broad, second only to Achilles in strength. From Pylos comes old Nestor, wise in counsel, whose age and experience guide the younger men. From Crete comes Idomeneus, steadfast in his loyalty. One by one, the heroes of Greece gather, each with his ships, his men, and his ambitions. The numbers grow staggering. Later tradition speaks of 1,000 ships, so many that the poet Aeschylus would call the war the tale of 1,000 oars. Archaeologists caution us, such numbers may be poetic exaggeration. Yet the image has endured, the beaches of Aulis crowded with ships, their black hulls drawn up on the sand, their sails furled, their warriors encamped beneath the open sky. Consider what such a gathering must have looked like in reality. The Greeks of the Bronze Age were seafarers, their ships long and sleek, built of oak, their prows painted with eyes to watch the sea. Each vessel could carry 50 to 100 men, their shields stacked along the sides, their spears rattling as they marched aboard. The air would be filled with the bleating of animals brought for sacrifice, the cries of children left behind, the sound of smiths hammering bronze into final shape. At Aulis, where the fleet was said to gather, the Greeks faced delays. The winds would not blow, and the ships lay stranded. The seers declared that the goddess Artemis had been offended, and only a terrible sacrifice would appease her. Agamemnon, torn between his duty as a father and his role as commander, was forced to give up his daughter Iphigenia. Some versions of the myth say she was slain upon the altar, her blood spilled to call forth the winds. Others say Artemis, pitying her, whisked her away at the last moment, leaving a deer in her place. Either way, the story reveals the harsh truth of war. Before it even begins, innocence is the first to be lost. At last, the winds rise. The sails billow, ropes creak, and the prows of the ships turn eastward. The sea fills with the rhythm of oars striking water, the shouts of helmsmen, the cries of gulls overhead. The Greek host, united for the first and perhaps only time, sets forth upon the wine-dark sea. For the men who boarded those ships, the journey was filled with both fear and hope. Some dreamed of glory and plunder, of gold and fame. Others longed only to return home safely. Few could have imagined that they would be gone for 10 long years, or that many would never see their families again. From the beaches of Greece, the sight must have been unforgettable. Hundreds of ships pushing out to sea, their sails catching the wind, their prows cutting through the waves. Mothers and wives standing on the shore, watching the horizon, uncertain if or when their loved ones would return. The gods, too, watched, for in myth, every sail was guided not only by wind but by divine will. And so, the Greek armies assembled, bound by oath, bound by pride, bound by the promise of Helen's return. Yet beneath their unity lay rivalries, jealousies, and fates that would one day tear them apart. For now, though, they sail as one, a tide of warriors heading toward Troy, toward destiny, toward legend. The sails rise high, their linen catching the steady breath of the wind. Beneath them, the oars dip rhythmically into the dark sea, dozens of men moving in unison, their muscles straining, their voices chanting to keep the beat. The sound of wood creaking, ropes snapping taut, and waves breaking against the hull fills the air. The Greek fleet, vast and formidable, stretches across the horizon like a moving forest of masts. For the warriors aboard these ships, the world has changed. They have left behind the familiar hills of Greece, the olive groves and vineyards, the hearths where wives and children wait. Ahead lies uncertainty, the long voyage across the Aegean and the promise of war in a foreign land. The sea itself is both pathway and peril. The Greeks of the Bronze Age revered and feared it in equal measure. They called it the wine-dark sea, its surface glimmering with hues of red and purple at dawn and dusk. To sail across it was to place one's life in the hands of the gods. Storms could rise without warning, sweeping ships against rocky shores. Pirates roamed the waters, and strange islands dotted the horizon, their cliffs mysterious, their harbors uncertain. Every voyage was a test of skill, courage, and fortune. For this fleet, bound by a single cause, the dangers were multiplied by sheer size. Hundreds of ships needed food, water, and coordination. Their progress was slow, their endurance tested. The myths preserve glimpses of what this voyage must have been like. At times, the fleet was scattered by storms, forcing ships to seek shelter on distant islands. Some traditions speak of accidental landings, where the Greeks raided villages along the way, plundering supplies and angering local rulers. At one point, they are said to have mistakenly attacked Mysia, thinking it was Troy, only to retreat when resistance proved fierce. These episodes remind us that war, even in legend, is never a straight line. It is filled with diversions, delays, and mistakes. Among the ships, the warriors passed their time in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. Some sharpened their weapons, testing the edge of their bronze swords. Others sang songs to steady their hearts. The rowers, often men of lower status, pulled at their oars for hours at a stretch, their bodies aching, their minds drifting into rhythm with the sea. At night, when the ships anchored near islands, the men built fires on the beaches, cooking fish or roasting meat brought from home. The stars overhead served as both comfort and compass. Constellations like Orion and the Pleiades guided their course, reminding them that though they were far from Greece, they were still under the same sky. In such moments, myths and reality blur. Did Achilles stand on the prow of his ship, his golden hair catching the sea breeze, dreaming of glory? Did Odysseus pace the deck, already plotting the clever strategies that would one day become his hallmark? Did Ajax, massive and strong, sit in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon? For the poets, such images captured the essence of the journey, men of flesh and blood carried toward their fate by wind and water. The gods, too, were said to watch closely. Poseidon, lord of the sea, could raise waves in anger or grant calm passage. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, while Aphrodite and Apollo leaned toward the Trojans. Every gust of wind, every shift in the tide, could be read as divine will. For the sailors, prayer and sacrifice were constant companions. Before setting out, bulls or goats were offered on the shore. Libations of wine were poured into the sea. Songs rose into the night, calling for safe passage and victory to come. From a historical perspective, such a voyage across the Aegean was entirely plausible. Archaeological finds reveal that the Mycenaeans were skilled sailors. Their ships, long and narrow, could travel great distances, carrying warriors and supplies. The scale described in myth may be exaggerated, but expeditions of significant size were not beyond their capacity. Trade routes connected Greece to Asia Minor, Cyprus, and beyond. The men who sailed to Troy would not have been venturing into the unknown, they were following well-worn paths, guided by memory and tradition. Yet the voyage was not without loss. Some ships would have been wrecked in storms. Others may have turned back. For those who pressed on, the sight of Troy's shores must have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Rising above the plain, the citadel of Troy commanded the land around it, its walls gleaming in the sun. To those weary from weeks at sea, it was the beacon of their quest, the place where destiny awaited. In the silence of dawn, as the first ships approached the coast, the men would have strained their eyes toward the land. They would have seen the smoke of hearths rising, the green fields stretching inland, the dark outline of walls against the sky. They would have gripped their spears, tightened their belts, whispered prayers beneath their breath. For all the stories, for all the songs, this was no longer myth. This was the beginning of war. And so, across the wine-dark sea, the Greek fleet arrived, battered by storms, tested by distance, but unbroken in resolve. Behind them lay Greece, waiting. Before them lay Troy, defiant. The voyage was over. The siege was about to begin. The sun rises over the Anatolian coast, casting long shadows across the plain that stretches before the city of Troy. The Greeks, weary from their voyage, drag their black ships onto the sand, their hulls grinding against the shore. The air is filled with the sound of men leaping onto land, their armor clattering, their shouts echoing across the beach. Fires are lit, altars prepared, sacrifices made to the gods for safe arrival. The greatest expedition Greece has ever known has reached its enemies' gates. From the walls of Troy, the Trojans watch. The city, perched upon its high mound, commands the view of the plain and the sea beyond. The sight must have been staggering. Hundreds of ships, their prows carved with painted eyes, their sails furled, their warriors spilling onto the sand in a mass of bronze and wood and leather. To the Trojans, this was no mere raid. This was an invasion. In myth, the Greeks wasted little time. They charged the beaches, eager to test Troy's strength. Prologue to the long siege that would follow, this first assault set the tone for years of conflict. According to later poets, Protesilaus, a prince of Phylace, was the first Greek to leap ashore. A prophecy had warned that the first man to set foot on Trojan soil would die. True to fate, Protesilaus fell swiftly, struck down by Hector or by another Trojan warrior. Yet his death was not in vain, for it spurred the Greeks onward. His sacrifice embodied the grim truth: this war would demand blood from the very first moment. The clash was fierce. The Trojans, led by their prince Hector, met the invaders with courage. Arrows whistled from the walls. Spears clashed against shields. Bronze blades rang out in the chaos of men pressing against one another. Sand churned red beneath their feet. The Greeks, relentless, forced their way inland, but Troy did not fall. Its walls, massive and well-built, held firm. The fortifications of Troy were legendary. Later poets claimed they had been raised by the gods themselves, by Poseidon and Apollo during their time of service to King Laomedon. Archaeology confirms that Troy was indeed a city of imposing strength. Excavations reveal massive stone walls, towers, and gates, built in layers over centuries. For the Greeks, fresh from their voyage, the sight of those towering defenses must have been daunting. Victory would not come quickly, nor cheaply. Having failed to storm the city at once, the Greeks settled on a different strategy. They established a camp on the plain, drawing up their ships in a great arc along the shore, their prows facing the sea. Between the ships and the walls of Troy stretched open ground, destined to become the battlefield of legends. Here, for 10 long years, the Greeks would fight, not only against the Trojans but against hunger, disease, and despair. Before this camp could be secured, the Greeks raided the surrounding lands. They sacked villages, carried off livestock, seized supplies. The war, from its first days, was brutal not only to warriors but to the innocent. Women were taken captive, among them figures like Chryses and Briseis, whose fates would later shape quarrels among the Greek leaders. Such acts remind us that beyond the glory of epic poetry lay the harsh realities of Bronze Age warfare. The Trojans, meanwhile, prepared for the siege. Within the walls, their king Priam gathered his sons and allies. Hector, noble and steadfast, stood as the city's greatest defender. Paris, though brave in his own way, remained a source of tension, for it was his deed that had brought this disaster upon them. And yet, Troy was not alone. Allied peoples from across Anatolia would soon come to its aid: the Lycians, the Phrygians, and others who saw in Troy a bulwark against Greek aggression. In myth, the gods themselves took sides. Athena and Hera, still angered at Paris's judgment in favor of Aphrodite, lent their strength to the Greeks. Apollo, protector of Troy, defended the city with his arrows of plague. The battlefield became not merely a contest of men but of divine will, each clash echoing in both heaven and earth. Yet beneath the thunder of bronze, there was silence too. Imagine a Trojan family, huddled in their home as the sounds of battle drifted over the walls, the cries of the wounded, the clash of shields, the distant roar of the sea. Imagine a Greek soldier, sitting by his ship fire at night, staring into the flames, wondering whether he would ever see his homeland again. For all the grandeur of epic, the war was made of countless human moments: fear, longing, grief, and hope. The first assault ended not with victory, but with stalemate. The Greeks could not take Troy by storm. The Trojans could not drive the invaders back into the sea. Between them stretched a gulf of defiance that no single day of battle could close. And so, the stage was set for a war unlike any before, a war of endurance, where years would pass, lives would be spent, and legends would be born. As the fires of the Greek camp flickered against the night sky, and the torches along Troy's walls burned steadily in answer, both sides must have known this was only the beginning. The beaches of the Troad lie scarred with fire pits and trampled sand. The ships of the Greeks stand in rows like blackened teeth, their prows facing the sea, their sterns dug into the earth. Around them rise the huts and tents of warriors, woven from hides and timber, a sprawling camp that becomes a second city. This is not a raid. This is not a brief quarrel. This is war by endurance, a siege that will stretch on for 10 long years. The Greeks, unable to storm Troy's walls in their first assault, resign themselves to a different strategy. They will wait, they will weaken, they will outlast. They send raiding parties into the countryside, stripping farms of grain, taking livestock, cutting off Troy from its allies. Smoke rises from villages, dark columns staining the sky. The once fertile plain becomes a place of ruin, a battlefield of ashes. And yet, the Trojans endure. Within their citadel, life continues in uneasy rhythm. Markets still open, children still play in the courtyards, sacrifices are still offered at the altars of Apollo and Zeus. But always, beyond the walls, the enemy waits. From the ramparts, the Trojans see the flickering of Greek campfires at night, the endless rows of huts and tents, the murmur of voices carried on the wind. They know that the Greeks are patient, and that time itself has become a weapon. For the Greeks, too, life at the camp develops its patterns. By day, warriors train or raid. By night, they gather around fires, telling tales of home, singing songs to steady their hearts. Some gamble with knucklebones, others sharpen their spears until the bronze gleams in the firelight. The sea provides fish, the raids provide cattle, but the long years weigh heavily. Men grow restless, leaders grow quarrelsome. Here, the myths preserve stories that reveal both the glory and the pettiness of the war. Chrysis, daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo, is taken captive and given to Agamemnon. When her father begs for her return, Agamemnon refuses. Apollo, angered, sends a plague upon the Greek camp, felling warriors with fever and death. Only by returning Chrysis is the god appeased. Yet Agamemnon, humiliated, takes another prize, Briseis, who had belonged to Achilles. This quarrel, though small beside the war itself, will prove momentous. Achilles, insulted and enraged, withdraws from battle. The greatest warrior of the Greeks refuses to fight. Without him, their strength falters. The myths remind us that war is not only against the enemy, but against pride, envy, and wounded honor. The long siege is not a story of unbroken combat. It is a rhythm of raids, truces, embassies, and duels. There are lulls when years seem to pass in silence, broken only by sudden storms of violence. Heroes fall, Protesilaus, as we have seen, later, Palamedes, accused of treachery and stoned to death by his fellow Greeks. The war consumes not only those who clash with spears, but those who suffer suspicion, rivalry, or the favor of capricious gods. And still, amid the ruin, life persists. Captive women serve in the camp, weaving and grinding grain. Priam, the aged king of Troy, presides over his council, urging patience and endurance. Hector, noble and steadfast, leads sorties beyond the walls, his bronze armor shining in the sun, his chariot wheels kicking dust across the plain. Paris, though brave in his own right, remains overshadowed by his brother, his beauty and his deed both a blessing and a curse. The siege becomes more than a contest of strength. It becomes a contest of memory. Each passing season deepens the resolve of both sides. The Greeks, bound by their oath, cannot return home without Helen, for to do so would be shameful. The Trojans cannot yield, for to surrender their queen would be to admit dishonor and defeat. Thus the war lingers, year upon year, each side waiting for the other to break. From a historical perspective, such a long conflict raises questions. Could a siege truly have lasted a decade? Archaeologists and historians debate this. Perhaps the 10 years of the Trojan War was less literal than symbolic, a way of marking a generation of conflict. Perhaps it was not one continuous war, but a series of raids and campaigns remembered as one. And yet, for the poets, 10 years gave the story weight and inevitability. A decade of waiting, a decade of fighting, a decade of legend. Picture the Greek camp on a quiet night. The moon rises over the Aegean, its pale light shimmering on the water. Warriors lie wrapped in cloaks, their shields stacked nearby, their breaths rising in rhythm. The sea laps gently against the shore. From the walls of Troy, torches burn, their glow visible across the plain. Between the two, silence stretches, not peace, but the pause before another clash. The long siege has begun, and with it, the transformation of men into myths. War, even when drawn out over years, is remembered not only for its endless clashes of armies but for the shining moments when champions faced champions, when the noise of battle gave way to the hush of a duel. In these encounters, myth tells us, The war was distilled into the meeting of two men beneath the gaze of gods and mortals alike. On the plain between Troy and the sea, dust swirled beneath the hooves of chariots. The cries of warriors and the clash of bronze filled the air. But then, at times, the tumult would fall quiet, and a duel would be declared. These contests were not always agreed upon formally. Sometimes they were challenges thrown in anger, sometimes desperate acts to end the slaughter. But always they carried weight, for the fate of the war seemed, for a moment, to balance upon the edge of a single blade. One of the earliest and most famous duels was that between Paris and Menelaus. At last, the wronged husband met the man who had stolen his wife. The armies drew back, forming a circle, their voices hushed. Paris stepped forward, gleaming in armor, bow in hand, but lacking the stature of his brother Hector. Menelaus, broad and fierce, advanced like a lion who has found the thief of his mate. The duel was fierce. Menelaus struck hard, seizing Paris by the helmet, dragging him toward the Greek lines. Paris, near death, was saved by divine intervention. Aphrodite, his protector, swept him away in a cloud, spiriting him back to Helen's side. To the Greeks, this was an outrage. The gods themselves prevented justice. To the Trojans, it was a reminder that Paris was both blessed and cursed by the goddess of love. Another duel, more solemn and more admired, came between Hector and Ajax. Hector, the steadfast defender of Troy, and Ajax, the towering warrior of Greece, met in single combat. They fought with spear and sword, shield against shield, bronze ringing in the sun. Neither could overcome the other. At last, as darkness fell, they exchanged gifts, a token of respect amid the savagery of war. Ajax gave Hector a purple belt. Hector gave Ajax a finely crafted sword. In this moment, the war revealed another face, not only hatred, but honor. Even enemies could recognize in one another the reflection of courage. Duels like these carried meaning beyond the clash of weapons. They allowed armies to pause, to channel their fury into the deeds of champions. They reminded warriors that behind the masks of war, there were men, each with families, each with dignity. And yet, they also fueled the poetry of legend, for to sing of one hero facing another was to capture the essence of human struggle in its purest form. The most fateful duel, however, would come later, between Hector and Achilles. That contest, still ahead of us in our story, would shape the very course of the war. For now, we linger in the Middle Years, when the war seemed endless, when no single duel could bring resolution. In the quiet between battles, both sides mourned their fallen. Priam wept for sons lost to Greek blades. Greek mothers waited in vain for sons who would never return. War was not glory alone, it was grief unmeasured. Yet the poets chose to remember the duels, for they shone like torches in the darkness, moments where the fog of endless killing parted, and human will met human will. From a historical view, such duels may preserve echoes of real practices. In many warrior societies, champions did step forward to fight before armies clashed. These contests could spare lives, or at least delay the slaughter. They also reinforced honor, for victory was not only collective but personal. Whether such duels truly decided much in the Trojan War, or whether they were later poetic embellishments, they speak to the values of the age, courage, skill, and the quest for remembrance. Picture the plain of Troy after one such duel. The dust has settled. The armies withdraw, either side victorious, either side destroyed. The sun sinks low, painting the sky in crimson and gold. Warriors return to their camps, some with relief, others with frustration. In the Greek camp, fires are lit, meat is roasted, songs are sung. In Troy, the people breathe easier for a night, though they know the siege continues. Between the two camps, the plain lies silent, marked with footprints, bloodstains, and broken weapons, a testament to both futility and valor. The duels of heroes did not end the war, but they gave it meaning. They turned the endless years of struggle into stories, into memories that could be carried home, sung by poets, whispered by mothers to their children. They were the heartbeats within the long silence of siege, moments when the war, vast and terrible, was captured in the clash of two souls. And as the years dragged on, the war became not only a matter of arms, but of the gods' shifting wills, of quarrels among men, and of fates that could not be avoided. The stage was being set for greater sorrow, and greater glory, still to come. Among all the heroes who strode across the plain of Troy, none was more feared, more admired, or more deeply bound to fate than Achilles. His very name has become a symbol of both strength and vulnerability, of brilliance that cannot last. To tell of the Trojan War is to tell of Achilles, and to tell of Achilles is to speak of wrath. The wrath of Achilles did not begin with Hector, nor with Troy itself. It began within the Greek camp, in a quarrel among allies. As the long war dragged on, spoils of victory were distributed among the kings and lords who had come to Troy. Among these spoils were not only treasure and armor but also captives. Agamemnon, high king of the Greeks, and Achilles, their greatest warrior, both claimed women taken in war as prizes. When Apollo, angered at Agamemnon's insult to one of his priests, sent plague among the Greeks, the high king was forced to surrender his prize. Bitter and humiliated, Agamemnon turned his fury upon Achilles, seizing from him the maiden Briseis. It was a gesture meant to assert dominance, to remind all the Greeks that Agamemnon was master. But to Achilles, it was an unforgivable insult. His pride, already fierce, could not endure such shame. In a rage that shook the Greek camp, Achilles withdrew from battle. He swore that he would not lift his hand against Troy again, not until the Greeks had suffered so greatly that they would come crawling to him in need. Thus began a strange and terrible silence. On the battlefield, the Trojans pressed forward with new strength, no longer checked by the deadly presence of Achilles. Hector led his men boldly, driving the Greeks back toward their ships. Panic spread through the Greek camp, for without Achilles their might seemed broken. Yet still Achilles sat apart, by the shore, gazing upon the endless sea. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, came to comfort him, her son both magnificent and doomed. She promised him that Zeus himself would tilt the scales in Troy's favor, ensuring that the Greeks would feel the weight of their loss until they begged for Achilles to return. We might pause here, to consider what this wrath means. Was it merely pride, a quarrel over spoils, or was it something deeper? In Achilles we see the figure of a man torn between two fates. He had been told from youth, he could live a long, quiet life, unremembered, or he could win eternal glory, but die young. His very presence at Troy revealed his choice, glory above all. Yet even as he sought it, he recoiled at insult, at dishonor. To him, honor was life itself. When Agamemnon humiliated him, it was as though his very reason for being at Troy had been undone. As the battles raged on without him, Achilles withdrew further into himself. He watched his comrades bleed and die. He heard their pleas for aid. And still he refused. His wrath had become a thing larger than himself, a storm that held back the greatest warrior from the field where he was most needed. But wrath cannot be contained forever. It smolders, it festers, and at last it bursts forth with consuming fire. For Achilles, the turning point would come not through insult, but through grief. The Trojans would strike a blow so deep that even Achilles, in all his fury, could no longer remain still. Before that moment, however, the Greeks endured wave after wave of Trojan assault. The ships were nearly set aflame. The cries of men rose into the heavens. And yet Achilles lingered, his heart heavy, his spirit bound by rage. In these scenes we glimpse something profoundly human. Achilles, the mightiest of all warriors, was paralyzed not by fear but by wounded pride. His wrath was both his strength and his weakness, a force that made him terrifying in battle yet blind to the suffering of others. In this paradox lies the enduring fascination of his story. The wrath of Achilles is not only myth. It is a reflection of the ancient world's understanding of the warrior's soul, that honor and shame could drive men as powerfully as hunger or thirst, that the fury of a single man could shape the fate of thousands. Soon that wrath would explode in battle, and its flames would consume not only Trojans but also the dearest friend of Achilles himself. But before that grief, before that fury unleashed, we linger here, in the heavy silence of his absence, when the greatest warrior of the Greeks sat by the sea, nursing his anger, while the tide of war turned against his people. The stage was set. The war had entered its darkest hour. And destiny, patient and unyielding, waited for the moment when wrath would finally take form. The war had turned grim for the Greeks. Day after day, Hector pressed his advantage. The Trojans surged beyond their walls, driving the Greeks back toward the sea. Chariots clattered, spears flew, and the black ships that had carried the Greeks across the wine-dark sea now trembled on the edge of destruction. Amid this chaos, one man could not bear the silence of Achilles any longer. Patroclus, the beloved companion of Achilles, watched as their friends fell. He saw men they had trained with, eaten with, fought beside, struck down by Trojan blades. Where Achilles had withdrawn into wrath, Patroclus felt only sorrow. He could not sit idle as so many perished. And so, he came to Achilles. The tent of the great warrior stood apart, near the shore, the sound of waves whispering against the sand. Inside, Achilles brooded, silent and distant. Patroclus knelt before him and spoke not with anger but with plea. "If you will not fight, at least let me. Lend me your armor, that I may lead the men and drive the Trojans from the ships. When they see your likeness upon the field, they will think Achilles has returned. Fear will seize them. And perhaps, just perhaps, we will turn the tide." Achilles, torn, at last consented. But he gave his friend strict warning. "Drive them back from the ships. Save our people. But do not go further. Do not storm the walls of Troy. That fate is not yours to seek." Patroclus, burning with courage and compassion, armed himself in the armor of Achilles. To the eyes of the Greeks, he was their savior returned. To the Trojans, he was the shadow of their greatest foe. The warriors rallied. The tide shifted. The Trojans faltered, stumbling back before the fury of this false Achilles. Patroclus fought with valor unmatched. He slew Sarpedon, son of Zeus, whose body fell upon the plain, mourned even by the gods. He drove the Trojans from the ships, saving the Greek fleet from fire. His heart soared with the thrill of battle, with the vision of victory. But in that rising flame of triumph lay his doom. Carried beyond the caution of Achilles' warning, Patroclus pressed further. He chased the Trojans to the very gates of their city. The walls of Troy loomed above him, high and unbroken. There, at last, Apollo himself struck him down. The god, angered at his daring, dazed him with a blow. His armor, once belonging to Achilles, was stripped from him in the chaos. Then Hector came. Hector, prince of Troy, hero of his people, met Patroclus in combat. Weakened, unarmored, Patroclus fell beneath his spear. With his dying breath, he prophesied, "It is not I who will end you, Hector. That doom waits in the hands of another." And with that, his spirit fled. The plain shook with the grief that followed. The Greeks cried out in anguish. The Trojans rejoiced, for they believed Achilles himself had been slain, until they saw the truth. Yet even as they triumphed, they feared what would come when Achilles learned that his dearest companion, more than a brother, had fallen. Back at the ships, the news reached Achilles. When he heard that Patroclus was dead, his heart shattered. His wrath, once directed at Agamemnon, now found a far greater target. Grief consumed him. He fell to the ground, pouring dust upon his head, weeping until the very sea echoed his sorrow. Thetis, his mother, rose from the waves to comfort him, though even she could not ease his pain. She knew that this grief would drive him back to battle, and that it would seal his fate. The death of Patroclus was more than the loss of a friend. It was the spark that would ignite the fire of Achilles' return. It revealed the deepest truth of war, that glory is purchased with grief, that victory is bought with the lives of those most dear. For the Trojans, it was a moment of triumph. For the Greeks, a moment of despair. But for Achilles, it was a turning point from which there could be no return. His wrath, long smoldering, was about to blaze forth in fury so terrible that the plain of Troy itself would tremble beneath it. And so the war, which had lingered in stalemate, quickened toward its destined climax. The death of Patroclus was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end. The plain of Troy lay heavy with grief. The body of Patroclus had been carried back to the Greek camp, torn and battered, stripped of armor by Hector. Around it, the Myrmidons, Achilles' own men, wept bitterly. But none wept more fiercely than Achilles himself. The man who had once sat silent in wrath now roared with a grief so deep that even the gods took notice. By the shore, he cried out to his mother Thetis. Rising from the foam, silver-footed Thetis came to him, her heart pierced with sorrow at the suffering of her son. Achilles clung to her, his tears mingling with the salt of the sea. "Mother," he said, "Patroclus is gone. Hector has slain him. My dearest friend, my other self. I will not live if I cannot avenge him. Grant me armor once more, that I may return to battle and bring ruin to Hector." Thetis, though she knew what his return would mean, promised to help. She went to Hephaestus, the god of fire and forge, and begged him to craft new armor for her son. The god, moved by her plea, set to work. From the flame and anvil came a shield vast and radiant, decorated with scenes of the world itself, cities at peace, fields in harvest, dances of joy, stars wheeling in the night. It was the cosmos given form, placed into the hands of a single man. When Thetis brought the armor to Achilles, it blazed with light so dazzling that all who saw it trembled. Even the bravest shrank back, for they knew that wrath itself was returning to the field. But before he could fight, Achilles sought reconciliation. He called an assembly of the Greeks and faced Agamemnon. The quarrel that had once driven him into silence seemed small compared to the grief that consumed him now. Agamemnon, too, recognized the folly of their feud. Words of bitterness gave way to words of apology. Gifts were offered, Briseis restored, though her return was overshadowed by the sorrow that hung over all. The army, weary and bloodied, looked to Achilles with hope renewed. Yet Achilles himself had no joy left in his heart. His return was not for glory, not for spoils, but for vengeance. He knew, and he confessed to Thetis, that his fate was sealed. By avenging Patroclus, he would shorten his own life. Death was waiting for him, near the walls of Troy. And yet, he chose it willingly. Better to burn bright in honor than fade in shadow. When at last he strode onto the battlefield, clad in his new armor, a hush fell. The Trojans, who had tasted triumph, felt dread and awe at their courage. Achilles' very presence was like a storm breaking over the plain. His chariot thundered, drawn by immortal horses, their manes streaming like fire. The cry he gave as he charged shook the hearts of men. From that moment the tide turned. Achilles' wrath poured forth, unstoppable. No spear could stand against him, no shield withstand his fury. The river's commander, swollen with corpses, rose up against him in anger, yet even the river could not quench his fire. Gods themselves moved upon the field, Apollo aiding the Trojans, Hera and Athena supporting the Greeks, but still Achilles carved his path. Every strike, every kill, was not for conquest but for Patroclus. His grief became a blade sharper than bronze, his love transformed into a storm of destruction. Hector, the mightiest of Troy, awaited him, knowing the final confrontation could no longer be delayed. For now, we leave Achilles amid his wrath, sweeping across the plain like fire through dry grass. His return marked not the end of war, but its terrible climax. The Greeks had regained their greatest warrior. Troy had gained its darkest fear. And the gods, watching from Olympus, knew that destiny was racing toward its appointed hour. The plain of Troy lay thick with the dust of battle, and the cry of Achilles rang louder than the clash of spears. He drove through the Trojan lines like a storm, scattering men as a lion scatters sheep. The wrath that had once smoldered in silence now burned openly, fierce and unrelenting. Hector watched from the walls. He had seen many warriors before, had faced Ajax and Menelaus, had fought through years of siege. But Achilles was something more. To see him in his new armor, blazing like the sun, was to glimpse the hand of destiny itself. Hector's heart quivered, yet he did not shrink. He knew the hour he had long awaited was here. The Trojans, struck with fear, fled behind their walls. Only Hector remained outside, standing before the gates. His father Priam and his mother Hecuba cried from the ramparts, begging him to retreat within, to save himself for another day. but Hector shook his head. I cannot hide. I have led these men, and if I shrink now, shame will follow me forever. Better to face Achilles, even if death awaits. The two champions met upon the plain, the walls of Troy looming behind, the Greek ships distant across the dust. But when Achilles rushed forward, Hector faltered. Fear overcame him, and he turned to flee. Around the city they ran, once, twice, 3 times, the sound of their footsteps echoing against stone. The people upon the walls watched in silence, their eyes following the desperate chase. At last, Athena intervened, appearing in the guise of Hector's brother, urging him to stand and fight. Believing he was not alone, Hector turned to face Achilles. But when he saw the truth, he realized the gods themselves had deceived him. Even so, he lifted his spear. The duel began. Hector hurled his weapon, but it glanced off the impenetrable shield forged by Hephaestus. Achilles advanced, spear poised, eyes burning. He thrust, and his weapon pierced Hector's neck. The Trojan prince fell, the breath leaving him in gasps. With his final words, he begged Achilles, "Do not leave my body for the dogs. Grant me at least the honor of burial." But Achilles, consumed with wrath, refused. His voice was hard as iron. "No prayers, no bargains. Patroclus lies unburied, and so shall you." And with that, he bound Hector's body to his chariot by the ankles and dragged him across the plain, dust and blood trailing in the wake of his fury. The sight struck terror into the Trojans upon the walls. Priam and Hecuba cried out in agony, their voices echoing through the city. And even among the Greeks, some turned away, troubled by the savagery of Achilles' grief. Hector's death was more than the fall of a man. It was the fall of Troy's hope. Their champion, their shield, had been torn down. Without him, the city stood vulnerable, its fate hanging by a thread. And yet, in that moment, Achilles too was lost. For though he had avenged Patroclus, his wrath had consumed him utterly. He had crossed the line between honor and desecration. What remained was not the noble hero but the embodiment of grief unrestrained. The gods themselves looked upon the scene with unease. Zeus, ruler of Olympus, shook his head, for he knew that Hector's death would not end the war, but draw it ever closer to the doom appointed for both Trojans and Greeks. Night fell over the plain, the body of Hector dragged again and again around the camp of Achilles. Torches flickered, fires smoldered, but the hearts of men were heavy. For they knew they had witnessed a turning point, the death of Troy's greatest defender, the unleashing of Achilles' full fury, and the tightening grip of fate. The death of Hector shook the city to its core. In the days that followed, mourning spread through Troy like a shadow. Priam wept for his son, Hecuba for her child, Andromache for her husband. The walls that had once seemed unbreakable now felt like a prison, enclosing grief and foretelling doom. Yet the war did not end with Hector's fall. The Greeks still camped upon the shore, and the Trojans still held their walls. For months, even years according to some tellings, the struggle dragged on. Achilles himself would soon meet his fate, slain near the Scaean gate by Paris, guided by Apollo's arrow to that single mortal point, his heel. The mightiest of warriors fell, and with him much of the Greek spirit. But destiny had not yet finished its course. Without Achilles, the Greeks searched for another way to end the war. They sought prophecy, and prophecy answered. Troy would not fall unless they brought new weapons, new heroes. They fetched Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, from his home. They lured back the cunning Odysseus, whose mind was as sharp as any blade. And together they turned to guile, for strength alone had failed to break the walls of Troy. Thus was born the plan of the horse. A great wooden figure, towering and hollow, was built under Odysseus' design. It was offered as a gift, a token of supposed surrender to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. The Greeks then feigned retreat, burning their camp and sailing away, though only to hide upon a nearby island. The plain, once filled with war cries, fell strangely silent. All that remained was the horse, massive and still, its form both wondrous and ominous. The Trojans, weary of war and hungry for hope, gathered around the strange offering. Some urged caution. Cassandra, The prophetess, cursed never to be believed, cried out that doom lurked within. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, warned them. Beware of Greeks, even when they bear gifts. But fate, stronger than reason, guided their choice. When serpents from the sea devoured Laocoon and his sons, the Trojans took it as a sign that the horse must indeed be sacred. With shouts of triumph, they dragged it through their gates. That night Troy celebrated. Fires blazed, wine flowed, songs filled the air. After 10 long years, they believed the war was over. The horse stood silent in the square, its belly hiding the chosen warriors of Greece. While the Trojans slept, Odysseus and his men crept from the hollow belly, opened the gates, and signaled to the fleet waiting in the dark. The Greeks returned, pouring through the gates like a flood. Troy awoke to fire. The city burned, its temples toppled, its streets choked with smoke. Warriors clashed in alleys, families fled in terror, the cries of the doomed echoing into the night. Priam, the aged king, was cut down before the altar of Zeus, his blood staining the very temple he sought as refuge. Andromache was taken, her infant son cast from the walls. Cassandra, once ignored, was dragged from Athena's shrine. It was the end. Troy, proud and ancient, fell not to strength alone but to cunning, to deception, to the long patience of fate. Its towers crumbled, its people scattered, its name forever remembered not as a living city but as a legend. And so the war that began with the love of Paris and Helen ended with fire and ruin. The Greeks sailed home, though few found peace. Many wandered, like Odysseus, for years upon years. Others met storms and wrecks, their victory bringing no joy. For such is war, it devours not only the defeated but also the victors. History and myth entwine here, as they have throughout our tale. Perhaps there was a great city on the coast of Anatolia that fell to foreign warriors. Perhaps the memory of that war was woven with poetry, with gods and heroes, until it became something greater than fact, a mirror for human longing, pride, and sorrow. We remember Troy not simply for its fall, but for what it tells us, that love can spark wars, that pride can destroy kings, that honor and grief can drive men to greatness and to ruin. The story has lingered across millennia because it is not only about Greeks and Trojans, but about us, about the timeless struggles of the human heart. And so, as the fires fade, as the last cries fall silent, Troy rests in memory. Its walls lie in ruins, yet in the realm of story they stand forever, a warning and a wonder, a tale to be told under starlit skies. You've been listening to Calm History. Tonight, we walk together through the myths and realities of the Trojan War, from the walls of Troy to the fire of its fall. If this story brought you peace or curiosity, we invite you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your reflections in the comments below. Every gesture helps us continue creating long-form history for relaxation and sleep. And now, until our next journey into the past, may your night be calm, and your dreams gentle.